Dawei, thank you for being with us here and for having us here on the campus of Tsinghua University. It's really special.
Thank you, James. And first of all, welcome to Tsinghua.
Dawei, you recently spoke about the world and you described it in terms of being very, very difficult. There are multiple stress points that the world is trying to navigate or trying to survive. But what are those stress points for you? When you think about the world and its complexities, what comes to mind and what does that mean?
Yeah, I think there are several things that really I have some very heavy, very big concerns about. First, I think is a tendency that we will experience every day, that this world is splitting into different camps. I don't know how many, maybe two camps or different camps. So the economy become, decoupled to each other, and I think that's kind of course, everybody say, I just want to de-risk, I don't want to decouple, but I think because the lack of the trust and because of the complexity of the most advanced technology, it's really hard to limit the scope of this de-risking, and it's very easily to expand into the decoupling, and then the standard of new technology, then the way you run the different countries and regions, then the global governance institutions. I think we are facing a very real challenge that this world is splitting into different camps. If that happened, if it become more serious in the coming years, I think what we have experienced since 1990s, those old good days will pass. I mean, everyone will suffer from. Yeah, I say everyone will suffer. I'm not saying we are going to die, but I mean the quality of life will decrease. We will squander, we will waste a lot of potential that the human being should have to make everyone have a better life. I think we are facing the danger that probably because of this split, because of this bloc politics, we may have problems. Yeah.
Well, you're using words like bloc
Yeah.
and camps, and it makes me think also of the social fabric, because around the world, of course, there is an emergence of tribalism as well in society. One example being what's referred to as the woke culture. In a sense that has value because people are awakened to past injustices, and how do you redress those as well? Is there a link between that kind of bloc and camp to the bloc and camps that you described just now?
Yeah, what I described is mainly about this, you can say tribalism among the countries or between the different countries. And you described what you mentioned, like a woke culture. It's mainly, I think it's mainly a separation in one society or in one country, right? For example, in the West, I mean, different people have different identity problems now. But that kind of in-state this split, I think it's not so serious in terms of its economic and social technological consequences. It's more or less a social split. But what I'm describing, this international split, I think it will, for example, it will reduce the economic efficiency. Right? When we used to, in the globalization period, all the countries, different companies, they are interconnected to each other. But now they are split. And in the future, maybe when you come to China, you need to use another cell phone because maybe your cell phone in other countries cannot use here. So everybody needs 2 or 3 cell phones. When you go to other country, you want to drive a car, but you found the automatic system is totally different. So that will make us suffer a lot. And in this split, in this bloc politics, and people, different country and different people will have strong tension, and probably it will also lead to conflict and war. So that's, I think, very, very serious.
When we have this conversation, I think about my 6-year-old nephew, and I'm sure you think about your 15-year-old teenage son. When we think about the people who are important in our lives, amongst them your many students here at Tsinghua University, Are you confident that we have the experience, the incentive, the willingness, and the skill set to address the very, very difficult world that you see?
I'm not so confident, to be honest. I think now we as adults, I think all of us are talking about like maintaining the peace, avoiding a war, or maybe reinforce globalization, this kind of thing. Everybody talks about that. But can we particularly the policymakers and those in the, who can have impact on this, can really do something, for example, to correct the mistake that different countries are made by ourselves? Are you willing to admit, to recognize that I'm sorry, I messed it up. This is something I have done mistakenly, and maybe China need to do this, the U.S. need to do that, Russia need to do that, and different other countries. I mean, to say that we need a peaceful world is one thing. How to make it happen, I think, is another thing. It's very costly. I don't think we can do that.
And not only peace, but lasting peace is a very different version of peace. You bring up the United States and China, and I think about 45 years of normalization of diplomatic ties, which is 2024. We should be using the verb celebrate. So we should be saying we are celebrating 45 years of U.S. China relations in its modern era. Mm-hmm. But instead we use words like honor or mark as a more neutral approach to it. Where did that trust disappear to? And was there real trust to begin with when you reflect on almost a half century of relations?
I think that trust actually has grown in those 45 years. Probably 45 years ago, I'm not very confident because I was too young at that time. I think I was 5 years old when the two countries set up the diplomatic relations. I don't know exact or in person know the mood at that time in 1979. I was too young to remember, but my hunch is at that time we of course we have some strategic consensus, like we need to balance the Soviet Union together. We may have that consensus, but for ordinary people, for a lot of decision makers, I think at that time we still had a very strong suspicion to each other. For example, China believes we are a socialist country, the US is a capitalist country. Can I really rely or trust them? But I think in those 45 years, as both countries, China and the US, got benefit from that process, like we conclude the Cold War peacefully, right? And then the two countries' economy grow very, very dramatically after the end of the Cold War. So in that process, I think because the two people benefit from that process, that trust has grown, I think, dramatically. While having said that, in past 8 years or maybe 8 to 10 years, I think this trust declined dramatically. I think for different reasons, but to be in short, I think the U.S. believe China take advantage or utilize it. It's not fair. It's not in the U.S. interest. While China think the U.S. policy to China is so harmful in past 8 years. So this trust has been damaged dramatically. So this is a quite complicated process, I will say.
Let's look at the Middle East today. Mm-hmm. That and Russia, Ukraine, and what's happening over in Yemen and in other parts of Africa are really concerning, and they're not separate to the US and China, both in its joint ability to meet the moment of these challenges, but also to understand that the world is not separated into regions. What one does has an impact on the other. on our neighbors, whether our neighbors be the person living next door or the person on the other side of the world in the next continent. You said recently that what's happening in the Middle East in terms of the decision making around international policy is still being determined by a few major powers rather than by the collective multilateral systems that were established and designed to do that very thing, to provide a representative voice, an inclusive voice. But we're not really seeing that. We're just seeing a few countries trying to moderate or intervene even. How do you change that so the world moves on from a post-war architecture that was very relevant in 1945, but we're not in 1945 now?
Yeah, I think now, obviously, we are saying farewell to that old order, right? 1945, or even post the Cold War structure. I think we are gradually departing from that. How to transform it to a more effective way to govern today's global challenges and also reflects today's international politics. I think this is a huge challenge. So we are ideally major countries like China, U.S, Russia, and other countries, we need to sit down together to discuss it. But obviously, it won't happen. It won't happen. So I think we are facing a possibility that this real global governance mechanism, like what we have seen after 1945, the UN system, or later like WTO system, I think we are facing a danger that those global platform or mechanism will collapse. Or maybe they will be there, but not actually not work. I think this is a big challenge we are facing.
I'll touch on the UN in just a moment, but before that, some Americans, including one of the speakers at your conference, say that the United States is aware that this system is beginning to withdraw, but that Americans are not ready to let go of that yet. What's your take?
I think the U.S. I think there is a strong mood in the United States. That is, why should the U.S. pay special, or share to take the responsibility to take care of that system? Or why should the U.S. pay the price, the cost for that? I think in the U.S. there is a sentiment of this isolationism. It's rising in the United States. I think ordinary people don't want to spend money on that, or don't want their soldier die for that. So the U.S. is, I think the reason of this global governance mechanism, the reason of its collapse partly can be attributed to the U.S. unwillingness to maintain it. I respect that sentiment, that mood, because this is a choice of American people, and if the U.S. dominates everything, other countries don't like. But I mean, as U.S. is withdrawing from that, who can fill that vacuum? I don't think any country can fill that vacuum.
I'm going to be a little provocative over here and ask you, should we not have empathy and gratitude for the United States, given what Prime Minister Kishida said in Washington a few weeks ago, where he said America has taken on this burden? Now, some people will say that was a choice. That was a volunteer choice to take on that burden. But should we also thank the United States for ultimately taking on something which exerts a lot of pressure on itself with its own voters?
Of course, to be honest, I think we should thank the U.S. There, in the world, there has to be some country play a bigger role to maintain the system. I think the U.S. played that role and paid the price. And actually, in that order, I think a lot of countries benefit like including China. China probably has been the biggest beneficiary from that system, particularly after the end of the Cold War. So the U.S. played basically a constructive role to maintain that order. But of course, at the same time, we have also need to admit that the U.S. made many mistakes when the U.S. tried to maintain that responsibility, right? This is two separate things. Yes.
Would Americans then feel that China has benefited, even exhausted the benefits of that system, and so it's now convenient for China to move on and construct a new system that will then ensure that it continues to benefit going forward in other ways?
I think what China wants is not constructing a totally brand new system. Actually, I think China has been for a very long time argued that we want to maintain current system. We want to maybe make more contribution to this system. And China also want to, of course, reform some element of that. But the problem is, for different reasons, like the U.S. believe China is an illiberal country. Are you really qualified to make a bigger contribution to this system or to reform? Only liberal countries can play that role in this liberal international order. So I think both China and the U.S. maybe missed some opportunity to, or I would say maybe the U.S. missed some opportunity to work with China together, try to share the burden and also make the system better. But the U.S. more or less view China as a revisionist. When China say, I want to make some contribution or reform, then the U.S. believe that China want to overturn the whole order, the whole system. I think that's wrong. But I think that's a misperception. But that's so widely accepted perception in the West. It's very unfortunate, I think.
Let's apply some of these discussions to the United Nations. China has contributed richly to that system, to that existing system, being in the form of the largest contributor of peacekeeping forces and also as a major funder to the outcomes of the Sustainable Development Goals, so that countries in the global south have a shot or a better shot at achieving those goals nationally. The UN reform discussion has continued for some time. A number of countries really want to get onto that Security Council, which in effect has been gatekept for 5 countries and possibly in some discussions for a 6th, being the P5+1 Germany. These are largely the P5, the victors of the Second World War. You've got Germany as a 6th in some ways, as a major global economy, I think number 4 in the world. But I have a concern that you reform and bring on more voices, which I'm in favor of, but that it doesn't become a checklist for affirmative action, that it needs to be set up with the guarantees that those new members, that those new countries that will benefit from reforms will also be allowed to take part in the decision-making process and have their imprints on the results that come out of those decision-making processes. What's your take on reform?
Yeah, to be honest, I think that's a very too difficult topic to reform the UN. UN is the product of the World War II. So at that time, it's relatively easy to create a new organization like UN and decide who should be the P5, right? Because those P5 were the countries won the World War II. So it's quite easy, and the war decided the outcome. But now fortunately, we are in a peaceful transitional period of the order. Then we want to reform something peacefully. I think that means it's very difficult. Like you are eating your lunch, and suddenly I said, I need to, try to reform the food in your plate, and give some food to others and add some food to your plate. So everybody have very complicated calculation here. I agree with you that I think the UN, particularly the Security Council, need a better representation of other countries. But where is the boundary? Which country is more qualified than others? Or like last week, I was in Europe. We also touched upon these questions, and then one of the participants asked the other European participants, do you think we can? I mean, both of them were Europeans, so they say, do you think we can reduce our representation in UN to one vote as Europe? And the other interlocutor immediately say, no, I cannot, because now they have France and the UK in the council. So then you bring in Germany, then you have 3 votes. So I think that's very, very difficult. And bringing in new members also means maybe lower efficiency. I think this is already a problem of UN and other multilateral organizations, right? So I don't know, that's too difficult. I think we need a very, very long process. We need to be very patient. But most importantly here, I think the China, US, Russia, Europe, those players need some consensus first. We cannot do anything without the consensus among those major players. Yeah, but because those countries' relations now are so bad, they don't talk to each other, and sometimes UN become an arena for great powers to compete. I think that how can we, under that circumstances, how can we expect them to work together to reform it? I'm very pessimistic about that.
You know, I've moderated and chaired many discussions at the United Nations, both in New York and in Geneva in my UN role. And you find all these representatives of member states coming to the table and reading their set pieces that were passed to them by their capitals. Mm-hmm. And it's frustrating in the sense that you use the opportunity of being in the same room together to simply come with what you were told to come with, yeah, but not reflecting what you're hearing in the room, yeah, and finding common cross points that could actually build to consensus. Let's leave the UN. As you said, it's a complex subject and one that would require a much longer exploration in the future. I want to ask you, you were about 5 years old in 1979, so probably not too many memories of Vice Premier Deng and President Jimmy Carter up on the White House lawn. But what was your first exposure to the United States, your first memory of the idea of America?
The first time of the US, I think I watched a TV advertisement on TV. At that time, my parents bought a TV set, so black and white one, Hitachi Japanese one. There was a Procter and Gamble ads on TV. That was the first TV ad I've seen. I think that's a very interesting ad, I will say. It's basically the camera was at a U.S. American house, very nice house, and the housewife was washing dishes in the kitchen, and then the camera turned away to a lawn, and a kid, a Chinese kid, played I think he played the baseball there, and then there is a song said Xiaohua. Xiaohua is a Chinese name, right? Went to the U.S. And learned to play this baseball. And his mother now loved to use PNG, product of PNG. So that's the first American image in my memory. So it's a kind of typical American dream thing, right?
So the mother and son
Yeah.
in that commercial were Chinese ethnic.
Yeah. The ethnic Chinese. Obviously, they moved to the U.S. for I don't know. Yeah, immigrate into the U.S. So it's a kind of blue sky, very green lawn, beautiful house, and nice house utility. So basically, that's the image of the U.S. in early 1980s.
Did it shock you that you were living in China, which was still mired in the problems of poverty in the 1980s? Were you shocked by what you saw on screen, that people could have houses and gardens and the son would have time to go and play basketball? And did that shock you?
Of course. At that time, I think there was a big gap between the living standard of the two countries. So, at that time, you cannot imagine some people live in such a beautiful single house, right? In China, at that time, we don't have that in China. So it's totally different lifestyle. So that's in early 1980s, so 40 years ago.
I mean, your parents were already better off.
Yeah.
They were professionals.
Yes.
They were educated at university. But also you could afford a television set that was made in Japan.
Yeah.
It's funny how when you talk to Chinese people of the 80s or even 70s, it always comes down to television sets.
Yes.
In a conversation with Ambassador Cui Tiankai, who of course served 8 years as China's top diplomatic envoy in Washington, he said in 1979, his memory as a graduate student in Shanghai was seeing the two leaders waving from the balcony of the White House over the lawn, and he watched it on a neighbor's television set. There was like one family that had a small television set in the compound, and everybody crowded around it and watched it. Your story, is as much as it speaks to the idea of the American dream, was also the idea of globalization, watching an American consumer commercial in 1980s China on a Japanese made and designed television set. It seems sweet and innocent and a lovely era to go back to. Tell me about your childhood. You were born in Xian, a historic city, a former ancient capital, the home, of course, to many people know today, to the terracotta warriors. What was life like? And tell me a bit about how you were raised and what the experiences were at home and school.
Oh, I grew up there because my parents worked there. Both my parents worked for the defense industry in China, so they were from Shanghai, actually eastern part of China. But they had the opportunity to went to college in early 1960s, and after graduation, before the Cultural Revolution, at that time, China's external environment was already very, very serious at that time. China had a very bad relations with both Soviet Union and the United States at that time. So China moved a lot of factories and research institutes into the inner land. So as I said, my father worked for the defense industry, so their institutes, actually their institutes was moved to Xian, the inner part of the inner land, the northwest of China, in 1950s. So after graduation, my father went there. It's quite, so it's hard to imagine now, because for my father, he's from Shanghai, the most modern city in China. He grew up there. So actually, when he went to Xian, he told me it's really the living standard there was really low at that time. So because he was from Shanghai, for example, they eat, they have rice every day, but when you go to the northern part of China, they don't have rice. So they have to raise mantou, actually the steam bun, right? No rice there. So for them, that's very, very hard. My mother worked in a factory. When he went there, nothing there, it's just a ground. So they started to construct the factory. So that's a hard life in 1960s, and then in the Cultural Revolution. When I grew up, I was born in early 1970s. So I almost have no memory of Cultural Revolution. But when I have when I have memory, I still remember those hard time at that time. I mean, my father and the mother, of course, my parents, they are the middle class at that time, but the middle class still not very comparing with today. You know, the life is very, very it's hard, and but of course I'm very fortunate that they can bring me very good education, because I grew up in that institute. It's a big institute. It's an island in the rural area, because I said I grew up in Xian, but actually that's a suburb Xian, because it's in the defense industry institution, so it's in rural area. So we were an island in that sea of rural area. So thousands of my parents, the colleagues of my parents, were the graduates from different universities in China in 1960s and 70s. So all of us, when I was a kid, I don't speak the local dialect because everybody speaks Mandarin. And at that time, I even thought everybody should have a college degree, because all my parents' colleagues have the college degree. But when I grew up, later I found it's something quite unique. I grew up in that urban island, speaking Mandarin, good education. But that's a good time, because China already starts reform and reopening up. I start my career, my education in 1979, the year that the two countries set up the diplomatic relations, and China started its reform and opening up. So basically, I'm the kid. I think I'm a representative. I'm a kind of I can represent that generation that grew up under in the era of the opening up and the reform. So we got benefit from that.
What does that rural area look like today? Is it still that urban island that you describe, or it's completely
disappeared?
transformed?
It's disappeared.
Disappeared.
I mean, now it's part of the city. So the village disappeared. Some of my classmates at that time, they were from the rural area. So there is a village outside our island. There's a village. So they were from that village. So when I returned to my parents' home now, there's no village at all. It's a city, part of the city. So the village disappeared, demolished.
Including the factory that your mother helped to build and envision.
Yeah. The factory now is bankrupt, and I brought my mother back. My mother worked there till 1979. So he worked in the factory for 10 years. Then she moved to the institute that my father works. So they both work in the same institute later. But about 5 or 6 years ago, I drove my parents back to the factory that my mother worked. So it's a shabby, very, very. I mean, it's bankrupt. I mean, the whole factory. So some businessmen from Guangdong, from southern China, purchased it. So it's privatized, and all the old workers laid off. So it's not very good. It's not good. So it's kind of like a corner lag behind the booming China. So I feel very sad about that. I spent 6 years there.
Is life in China good today?
I think so, yeah, particularly for people like me. Of course, different people have different story. But for me, I think I have the life that I have never expected when I was in 80s or even 30s. No need to say when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I still remember in Xian, in the city that I live, we have the first hotel run by a 5-star hotel run by a Hong Kong businessman. So and some of my some of the kids who are not kids, teenagers in our island, in this island, went to that hotel, found a job there. So at that time in 1980s, they can earn 200 yuan per month. So then at that time I thought, wow, what a wonderful job.
200?
Yeah, 200.
200 yuan, which is about 30 US dollars a month?
Yeah, now 30, but I mean, 200 yuan at that time is already much higher than my parents' salary.
Who were about 100 at that time?
Yes, yes.
And what could you buy with 200 yuan?
You don't have much to buy at that time. The problem is, right? You don't have we didn't have a car to buy at that time. You have money, but I mean, 200 is quite a high income at that time. My parents both, college educated. They can, I think each of them can at that time maybe 120 something. Yeah.
Is the hotel still there?
I think so, but obviously it's not a very good hotel now. But I mean, at that time, I thought, oh, if one day when I grow up, if I can work in that hotel, that will be my dream life.
Really?
Yes.
So working in that hotel with a salary almost double that of your parents, who were professional, highly qualified figures in defense and engineering, the hotel itself was what you were aiming for at the time. I want to finish with where we are and in some ways circle back to where we began in this conversation. We're on the extraordinary grounds of Tsinghua University, a world-leading university, which was established in 1911 at a moment of absolute transformation here in China, which went from many, many dynasties of imperial rule to republic, and to the People's Republic to follow that. This here in itself is the site of a former imperial garden. This university was set up with some reference to United States and China and the relationship to follow. But what are your students being taught and what are they learning? And to go back to our first question, is that sufficient to meet the needs of a world that is in constant flux?
Yeah, I think the Tsinghua University is one of the, at least we have Tsinghua and the Peking University. Basically, these two universities be regarded in China as the two top universities. So Tsinghua is one of that. So probably this is one of the best university in China and or maybe in Asia. So the students here, I think
You're very modest. You're very modest. In the world, let me finish off that for you. In the world.
Thank you very much. The students here, first of all, those students, particularly the undergraduate students, they went through the very highly, extremely competitive Gaokao system. Gaokao system is the entrance examination for the university in China. Very, very competitive. So they are all very talented top university students here. So what they have been teaching here, I think basically just like American university or European students, basically the same. For example, I teach in the Department of International Relations. So my students, they learn like the courses like international relations theory, research methodology, mathematics, and they learn, of course, foreign languages, and they also learn a lot of courses like China-U.S. relations, history, this kind of thing. I think it's quite good. We have quite good education here, and students working very hard. And I think for example, the theory they are learning here, I think just basically the same at the American universities. The reading material we give them, I think most of them are also English. So some courses are taught in English. So basically what they are providing here, I think is quite similar to what you can imagine in American university. But to your question, is that adequate? Is that good enough? I don't think so. I think beyond what you can learn from the classroom, I think there are still a lot of things to do. I think the students today here, particularly in the university, particularly in those so-called elite universities, I think the task of them is not only to learn some knowledge, but to be the future leadership of a country, or maybe world global leadership, or industry or company, I don't know, a society, community. So they need to understand this dramatically changing globe as we discussed early. I think the students here still, I always encourage them to pay more attention to what is happening in the world. For example, in the Middle East, I always want them to debate, the pros and cons and the two sides. I mean, the Palestinian people and the Israeli people. What is wrong? What is correct? What is as a Chinese student, what is your position? Or you can have a debate like Russia and the Ukraine issue, right? I think what are the rationale behind the two sides? Why Russian did that? Why Ukrainian do that? I think the students need more. They need to pay more attention to what is happening now, or like a new technology, AI, this kind of thing. They need to understand what is happening now. Secondly, they need to think about why those people, Palestinian people, Israelis, different people have different rationale, why they have different value, why they have different policy. The logic behind that. I want them to step further. So in that regard, I think our students still have a long way to go. I think our university need to provide them more opportunity to think about, to reflect. That's the reason I always, like every summer vacation, I always bring my students to the United States to talk to American government officials, university professors, and of course their peers, the university students in the U.S., to understand why these two countries, why these two great nations have, both great nations, but why we have such a different policy, and also we have this tension now. So I want them to understand this, and then when they return to the country, they can know the world better. So I think this is a task that the university need to provide to our the students need to accomplish in the university, and the university need to provide them more opportunity to understand the world.
Unfortunately, I'm not your student. I wish I was, but we did start off the year in America in 3 different points,
Yes.
at 3 different places in Atlanta, and then Stanford and Palo Alto,
Yeah.
and of course in Washington, D.C. So it means so much to me that as we reach the midpoint of this year, we're finally speaking at your home at Tsinghua,
Yeah.
here in Beijing.
Thank you, James, for coming to Tsinghua, and I hope you can come more often, and we can continue this discussion, no matter in Beijing, Hong Kong, or somewhere in the U.S. Yeah, thank you so much.